Welcome to this exciting tutorial. Today we're going to be going further with our science fiction scene, building out a procedural sky and horizon environment for our space landscape. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just quickly outline what we're going to be achieving in this episode. So what we have is a really nice landscape that's been set out, but we still have this blank sky. It's kind of just a gray color. What we want to do is, using the same kind of procedural techniques that we used when creating our materials, I want to create a sky environment, a background environment that has a horizon with some sunlight kind of setting down and our sky getting darker and darker and stars coming out. So we're going to actually create an animated material. So the ideas that we apply in this tutorial are going to build on what we've done before. And what we do in this tutorial is actually going to be applicable to any other kind of shader, even if it's not in an environment shader, but it's on a material, on an actual object itself. You can still animate values. But this is a great way to take a look at, I guess, what's possible with animating values within a shader itself. Okay, so to get started, let's take a look at our graph view over here. So at the moment, you see we've got set up our material for our rock spire texture. And what we want to do is switch the mode so that we're working in the environment. So up at the top, you see we have our shader editor open, and the shader editor has this drop-down menu. At the moment, it's set to object, and we're going to just switch that over to world. Okay, so everything disappears, and now we're just affecting the world texture. Now, the world texture lives in this little tab as well with the world icon. And you can see right now that our surface of our world is set to background. Now, you could change this to a lot of different things. You actually can use shaders in your world. And when we're using cycles to create our render, one of the important things to note is that the color information of our world, which again is the sort of the giant sphere that surrounds our scene, the color information is being considered as light. So the really bright areas are going to be sending in light rays into our scene with the same color values. So you can actually light your scene with the environment. So this is where you would use like an HDRI image or a photograph if you're trying to create a realistic image based in an environment that you've captured with a camera. Okay, so with our world selected in the shader editor, we're going to take a look. Our two main nodes are the world output and the background. Now, the background, of course, corresponds to what we have selected as our surface. So we're using a background shader, which is a particular type of shader. And the world output is just like the material output for our shader graph when we're working in materials for objects, except this outputs to the world. Very straightforward. First thing we want to do is create our horizon or our atmosphere. So the way I want this to function is I want to have the atmosphere to be thickest at the horizon and to thin out as it moves up towards the zenith. And as it thins out, I want it to reveal more of the starry sky, the starry night sky. Also, at the beginning of our scene, I want the sun to still be up a bit, so kind of like a gray dusk kind of feel. And I want it to progress to a rich sunset with the stars coming out in their full shine. So in order to do that, let's start off by creating a gradient texture and applying it to our background. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll center in on a certain area so we can just have a look at what we're doing. We're going to isolate a section for our render. So I'm going to hit Control B, and I'm going to drag a box just here. So we're just looking at this area here. Now, it didn't show up because we've got our gizmos and stuff still turned off. So if I turn those back on, you can see that's what we just drew. And I'm going to go ahead and move to rendered views. So I'm going to hit Z and rendered, and cycles is going to queue up and show us what we've got, which is the big gray background that we've set here as our color. So that's what's happening here. All right, so let's get a gradient in. So I'm going to have go over into our shader editor, and I'm going to hit Shift A, and under texture, you're going to have, where is it? Gradient texture. Okay, so if I just plug the factor of this straight into color, you can see already that we've got a gradient happening, and it's white over on this side, and it progresses over to black on the right side of the screen. So it's traveling along the x-axis, all right? But we don't want that. We want it to travel along the z-axis, up and down. So we want to rotate this gradient texture. Now this is going to use the same technique for moving our procedural textures around as we used on our actual objects. So if you remember the node setup that we had, we started with a texture coordinate node to tell Blender exactly how we wanted it to derive the location of the texture. So we used the generated method, if you remember, and we piped that into a mapping node to then move it around. And then we pipe that into the vector of our texture, our gradient texture. So that was the same workflow that we used in our shaders. We're going to use that here as well. So first up, let's grab our texture coordinate. And then we're going to grab our mapping node. There it is. So you're going to use these two nodes a whole lot. You'll find with most every shader, every world shader, every object shader you create, you're going to have these in play. Now, a lot of times you're going to work with UVs, but generally speaking, when you're creating stuff procedurally, you're going to be working with a generated or object pretty much all the time as your texture coordinate. So we're going to work with generated because we can just take it straight from the object as it's generated and pipe that into the vector, and then we're going to pipe the vector into the vector object here. And of course, nothing's happened because we haven't changed any of our values. If we unplug the vector, it'll go away because using the mapping node requires the texture coordinate node, so it doesn't really know how to place things, so it's just going to disappear. So if yours turns out black, that's what's going on. So we'll just reselect that there. Okay, now what we want to do is rotate it on the y-axis. So let's grab, where's rotation? We're going to go onto the Y, and you see if I just rotate it a little bit, it's going to start to tilt. So let's type in 90 for 90 degrees, and bam, there you go. Now sometimes be aware with the gradient texture, it can be a bit hard to pinpoint where the gradient is, and you're going to have to rotate things or move things around a bit to find it, and then you can kind of get your values set right. But in this particular scenario, it works just really neatly just to use 90 degrees, and we have it in the right position. Now, we want to have the horizon brightest at the bottom and then kind of dim and invisible at the top. So don't worry about the fact that it's black here and white up here, because this is just the information. Just try and keep thinking of all these things in terms of their number values, not necessarily as their visual representation, because we need to use the number values to drive everything. So black is 0, white is 1. So everything Blender's doing in the background is using math, and it's just really helpful to keep thinking about things in those terms, because a lot of the nodes make a lot more sense when you do that. Okay, so we've rotated our background. Now, the next thing I want to do is get some more control to the colors and what's happening. So let's grab a color ramp and place it right here. And we're going to go ahead and flip the black and white values. I'll just drag those around, and I will bring the black right down so that our sky is black. And I'm going to change the interpolation method of our color ramp. So right now you can see it's set to linear. But if I set it to something like ease, it's going to give me a much more graduated effect. Try B-spline. Oh, B-spline's great. There we go. So that's really going to fade out slowly. So that's pretty good. I'm also going to create one more pip into our shader graph here, and I'll make this one black as well. And this way I can just control the fall off a little bit better. There we go. That's nice. Okay, we're going to leave that really loose at the moment because we're going to have to adjust this a bit more when we get into actually adding color. It may not blend in the same way, but for now, this is perfect. Okay, so this system now is effectively creating our atmosphere. Move our background and our world output over again just a little bit to make some more room. Okay, let's unplug that for now. Next thing we want to do is create our starry sky. So to do stars, a technique that I like to use is to use the noise generator. Now, noise is just another one of the many different algorithms that Blender has to create a noise pattern. And again, a noise pattern is an infinite black and white grayscale image that is tileable, so it goes on forever, and it's a random type noise image. So noise is a pretty general one. It can be used to make static. It's a lot harsher than some of the other more interesting ones that we've looked at so far. So let's go to texture, and we're going to pull up noise. So I'll just pump the color straight in so you can just see what it's doing on its own. So I'll drop our scale down so you can see it. So there you go. So you can see it's basically, it's a basic cloud shape, okay? And you can see with the color, you get this rainbow color. Because again, it's not just creating random grayscale values, it's also randomizing the color on top of that. So noise, like all the other shaders, all the other noise generators, it's randomizing everything under specific rules that create a nice kind of fractal type image that looks really great, especially when being used in creating natural environments, environmental things like rocks and trees and water, because things in environment and in our world actually behave under that same kind of fractal principle, if that makes sense. Okay, so we don't want to use the color because again, we're just focusing on the grayscale. So let's bring the factor in. So now we can just look at the black and white values. And we're going to drop that scale all the way up. We're going to just really increase it. We're going to go really high, maybe all the way up to, let's try 200 to start with. I'll type in 200. Now, in order to get this to start looking like stars, we need to crush down the black and white values so we just have these sharp little pinpricks of white. To do that, of course, we're going to use a color ramp. 10 points for guessing. All right, so let's grab our color ramp. It's under converter, by the way. I always want it to be under color because that makes sense because it's in the name, but it's in converter again because of how it functions. It's often used to convert things. All right, so let's drag this stuff around so we can get a nice pinpricky sky. It's looking pretty good. Oops, a little too much. We do want to have variations of stars that are variations in brightness, so I don't want to drag these too close together. And that's pretty good. We can tell that we still have some large kind of blop stars appearing, so I do need to increase our scale. So I'm going to go up to 500. And yeah, see now they're really getting tiny, and that's looking much better. We get too many stars there if we drag too far out with the black, so just be careful not to go overboard with it. Okay, I like that. That looks really, really good. Okay, so this is our star system. Okay, so we have our horizon and we have our stars. Now, if we mix these two together, I'll go ahead and grab a mix RGB node underneath there. Grab these guys, move them back a bit, and let's put the color of the first one in with the color of the second and put this into our background. Okay, so as you remember from before, when we're using the mix mode, which is what always comes in when you have a mix RGB, it starts out in the mix mode, and our factor is set to 0.5. What it's doing is it's taking half of this one and half of this one and putting them on top of each other, and that's our output. So we're not getting the full strength of either of these. So our stars are half as bright as they are if you were to look just straight up at our star shader. So we don't really want that. We want to have the full strength of stars up here in the sky, but then down here we want them to fade off as it mixes together. But we're going to have some problems as we do that. Okay, so let's get to that. Well, let's come to those problems so we can learn how to move through it. Okay, so you have to think about this again in terms of the number values. So black is 0, white is 1. So we've got full ones down here, and then these ones start to fade off to like 0.5s and 0.4, 0.3 until it's working all the way to being 0. And then every now and then we have these individual stars, which are pretty close to 1. They're like, it's like a 1 maybe, and a 0.8, and maybe a 0.5. What we want to do is we want to remove the stars that are down here, and we want to keep the stars that are up here. So in order to do that, what we can do is a couple different things. We could add all the values together. So these ones, if there's a star down here, we have a 1 and a 1, they're going to add together, we're going to end up with 2, which is a super value, so a value higher than 1. And that's possible in Blender, and Blender can calculate super values, and that's how we have a really wide dynamic range in our renders. But if we click clamp, then what it will do, it will limit the ceiling to 1. So anything that we add to a value that's already 1 isn't going to go any higher. So that could effectively achieve what we want to do. So if we switch this to add, and then we tick clamp, and we bring the factor all the way up to 1 because we want to fully add both of these together, now we're getting the effect we want. So up here, this is, let's say, a 0.5. and it's over a part of this background which is almost a 0, maybe like a 0.1. It's adding those values together so you get a bright spot. Whereas down here, the 1, or like, if it's a 0.9 and it's adding into one of our stars, it's getting close to 1 or over 1, it's just canceling out. So we're losing them. However, we want to add color to our horizon. And as we do that, these values are going to move off of being, perfect 1s and 0s, black and white. They're going to start having some variation. And so we want to be able to control these separately in order to get the right effect. So if I were to go into our color ramp here, select the brightest one, and let's go ahead and get our sunset colors in place. So I'll give that kind of like a pinkish red. And then our second color, I'm going to move to kind of like a blue, purplish blue, so that looks nice. And then I'll drag in the bottom black one just so we do have a bit of sky there. Bring the sun even closer to the horizon. Here we go. I might even add one more pip here and make that fully black, just so we do get some definite black. All right. So that's looking really cool. You can see we've got this bright section where the sun's just gone down, and then it kind of goes to that bluish horizon, and then we have the black of the night sky. But you can see we've got stars all the way down through here and even right down here at the bottom. And that's okay. That might be a cool effect if we're going for it. But in real life, you wouldn't quite get stars down here. You kind of begin to have them in this area, and you definitely have them up here, but this area we wouldn't. So you can see using add, it's not actually going to give us the effect we want. So the best thing for us to do is actually to create a separate pass where we filter out the stars that are closer to the horizon, and then use that to specifically control where we're showing stars. And that way we can just leave this area for dealing with the color of our horizon. So to do that, we can use the same system set up for our gradient, okay? But we're going to use a different color ramp. So let's create a new color ramp. Or even better, we'll duplicate this one. We'll bring the factor into it. And we will move these things over to give us a little bit more room. Okay, so this will be our color for the horizon, and this will be our filter for our stars. So first thing is, let's take this and move it back to black and white values. I'll also get rid of the extra pip that we added in there. All right, so this first one here, I'm going to go to the HSV, which is hue, saturation, and vibrancy, and I'm going to drag the saturation all the way down to 0. So we've removed all the color value, and now drag it all the way up, so it's pure white. Grab the next one, I'll do the same, drag the saturation to 0, and just double check this one is 0 as well. Yep, perfect. Okay, now it's just purely black and white. Okay, so we're going to use this, so I'll just show you what this looks like. So we're using this gradient to mask out these stars. All right, so let's think about how to do that. Our stars consist of 0, which is the black, and let's say these are all 1 just for simplicity. We want to have our 1s shine through except for where we're down here. So we're trying to cancel out the 1s, cancel out the positive values. The best way for us to do that is to multiply, well, okay, I'll ask you that question. In math, how do you make a positive value 0? The answer is you multiply it by 0. So you can make any number 0 by multiplying it with 0, right? So we need to do that with this image. We need to multiply this image with 0 where we don't want any color value, where we don't want any stars. So we need to have 0 down here at the bottom, which means down here needs to be black. And up here needs to be white, because of course, if you multiply any number by 1, you're going to get that same number unchanged. So having a gradient from black to white is going to give us the control we want to remove stars where we don't want them. Hope that makes sense. I hope I'm explaining it well. All right, so let's do that. Let's have a look at what our gradient looks like at the moment. So okay, we actually have the opposite of what we want. It's white down here and black up here. So we need to flip our gradient. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll just keep the pips where they are, and we'll just change their color value. So I'll grab the first one and make it black, and I'll grab the last one and make it white. Okay, now we flipped our gradient. We can leave this one the same because it's just a gray value that was in between the two already. So, okay, now we need to combine them. So let's go for a mix RGB again. So we'll type in mix RGB, put this here. So I can grab the color of our stars and the color of our filter, put it there. And now let's bring this into our background so we can begin to see what we have. So it's mixing right now, which again is taking half and half of both. And we're going to switch it to multiply. Now this is, it's easy to lose track of what's happening because mix RGB, this list is the same as what you would see like in Photoshop or After Effects. And often we think of those values in terms of their effect on the color. So you think, oh, multiply is going to just darken things and add's going to make things really bright and glowy. And we forget that it's actually referencing the mathematical thing that's going on in the background with those color values. And it's really helpful to just keep remembering that in Blender, all these nodes can function not just in terms of what they're doing with the color, but it's more about the math. So you can use these in weird ways. You can put a mix RGB node in a situation where you're not even dealing with RGB values. You might be dealing with the position of something, and you've got a vector of, a matrix of 3 different, values, and you can pipe those into a mix RGB node and multiply them with something else. So you can do some really interesting things with them. All right, so let's switch it to multiply, like we said, and we're going to move the factor all the way to 1 because we want to fully multiply them. And boom, there you go. You can see we've got nothing down at the bottom, and we have our pinpricks up at the top. So it's working perfectly, just like we wanted. Okay, now the next step is to replace in this one here. We want to replace the stars. We don't want the stars going directly in. We want our new filtered stars to go in as our second color. And there we go. Now we've got the control we want. So we can play around with this and drag these out to change how far it is that we're cutting off our stars. Might even go the other way with it. Bring the stars in a bit more towards the horizon. That looks good. Yeah, great. So we're getting little pinpricks there, and then it fades off. All right, perfect. I'm going to drag this out a little bit, so we've got atmosphere all the way up to the top. And I'm going to darken this up a bit because it's just a little too bright for my liking. Can't select it being that far away. All right, so let's darken the horizon down, something like maybe that. It looks good. And I will darken this one as well a touch. Okay, cool. That's a good point for our sunset sky. All right, things are looking good. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is animate our camera. So we've got our sky in place, and I want to go ahead and get my camera move working for us. So let's open up our scene elements and navigate over to our camera. Now, we need to think about how long we want our animation to be. Right now, the default is 250 frames. And if we just check how many frames a second our project's set to at the moment, we can go over to the printer icon. And if you just go right down here, you'll see frame rate is set to 24. That's going to give us a real filmic look, since film goes through a camera at 24 frames a second. So we'll keep it at this so it looks nice and cinematic. Now, we've got that checked. I'm happy to keep things at 250 frames. That should be enough for us for this particular project. But actually, you know what? Before we get that camera set, let's go ahead and put our egg shape into the scene. So we've got a focal point that we can look at. Now to do that, I want to line it up so that it's right in the middle of our scene. And so I'm going to get a bit of help with this little tab down here. So with the camera selected, select the camera tab. And under viewport display, you've got a bunch of different options. If you just drop down this box here, composition guides, there's an option here to show the center. And that's going to give us this nice dotted line that just crosses our frame so we can line things up. Okay, I'm going to change our render selection to be the full frame, just so that's not blocking your view. And I'm going to hit Shift A, and we are going to add in a UV sphere. I'm going to hit G and Z to bring it up on the Z value, and I'll scale it up a little bit, and G and Y to bring it towards the camera. And I'm just going to bring it so we're just in front of that spire and in between these. You'll have to find a good spot for yours, so just play around with exactly where you want it. The main thing is I'm trying to line it up on this Z-axis right down the middle of the frame. All right, so I'm going to scale it up on the Z-axis till I get just a little bit of an egg shape, and then I might just scale the whole thing down and hit G and Z to bring it back up again. Scale it up a little more. Perfect. All right, cool, that looks good. Now I want to rearrange my scene a little bit because I've got these things are intersecting it. I'm not sure I'm happy with that. We might play with that in the next tutorials. So we'll just get our camera laid out and we'll figure out those details next. You can also go ahead and right click on your object and shade smooth, just to go ahead and get that sorted. All right, so let's select our camera. Now the idea is as we move through the scene, I want to be pulling back to this position right here. So I actually want this to be my final endpoint. So I'm going to just click on this button here to jump to the endpoint of my timeline. And with the camera selected, I'm going to go to this orange box here, which is our transform controls for our camera. And I'm going to hit the I key, which will set a keyframe. So you just hover your mouse over the number values, doesn't matter which one, and hit the I key. I'll do the same for rotation. Hover my mouse over the numbers for the rotation, I, and now we've set a keyframe. And this is going to place one here on our timeline. And now I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning. I can also just click this button to jump to the first frame. And I'm going to use these controls to move the camera just right up to our egg shape. Maybe right about there. And I am going to rotate on the x-axis up to right about there. I think that looks good. All right, so we'll set keyframe again. So just hit I again, and you'll see everything turn. So when it's green, that means that there's a keyframe set somewhere on the timeline, but not here currently. This brown color means that you've changed a value, but you haven't set a keyframe for it. So if I was to move my playhead away from this point, we'd lose this value. It would jump back to whatever has been keyframed already for this camera. So make sure you remember that. If you set to, you can set to kind of make keys automatically, but it's easy to kind of lose track sometimes, and you can mess things up easily with that. But anyway, so let's just hit the I key again. You can also click these buttons to set keyframes. So now you can see we've got a keyframe set down here. So here we go. We can just hit the space bar and preview our animation. And you can see we're pulling back nicely and revealing our scene. All the different objects, because they're spaced out differently on the y-axis, it's really nice. We've got this good depth to the scene as we're pulling back through it. So awesome. Okay, now that we've got that move in place, the next thing I want to do is animate my sky. So if you remember, our goal is to have the sun feel like it's setting as the scene progresses. When we get to the middle point, right about frame 30, that's where I want to have the sunset that we've kind of designed fully in place. So I'll go ahead and reset my render selection and go to rendered view. And this is the look that I want for my sky at this point. So we've got the sky set where we want it. So right at frame 130, what we want to do is set a keyframe for the values that we're going to change. So we're going to be changing the color of the sky. And we also might change the location of these pips, so how well that atmosphere is spread out across the sky. The other thing I want to add keyframes for is how much we mix in our stars. So we'll animate this factor here. So we'll kind of turn the stars off so that they're not really on during the daytime. Okay, so let's go ahead and set a keyframe for that. So if again you just hover over the value and hit the I key, it'll set a keyframe. You can also right-click and add a keyframe, insert keyframe right there, just in case if you forget the hotkey. And we're going to set keyframes for each of the different pips in our gradient. So we'll select the first one, hover over the color, and hit I. You get that nice yellow box around it, just to be clear that you have a keyframe now. And we'll also keyframe the position. That's the position of this pip on the gradient. So we'll go to the next one, and again, I and I. Next one, I, and the final one, I and I. Now let's jump right back to the beginning of our scene, and I'm going to turn my sphere off so it's not in the way. And let's also expand our render view so we can see the actual horizon. And let's get something that looks a bit more like kind of a late evening, dusky kind of look. So the first thing I'll do is I'll spread out the bottom so our sun has come up a little bit, and I will move out these pips so that there's more atmosphere traveling all the way up in the sky. Now with our first color, the sunset color, let's take all the saturation out of it. So go to my HSV, hue, saturation, and vibrancy, and drag the saturation, maybe not all the way out, but just down so that it's pretty low. There's not a lot of color. Do the same with the next one. I'm going to drag the saturation out like this, and I might brighten it up a little bit. Yeah, that's nice. Okay, that's feeling pretty good. So now I need to remember to set keyframes for all these. So again, you can see we've got that brown color now highlighting saying that we've changed things, and this one's green, so saying we haven't changed anything about the position of the first one. But we'll go ahead and set keyframes for everything, just for clarity. There we go. And then our final one. Perfect. Okay, now we should have keyframes functioning for all of it. So let's just have a quick, actually, if we preview in cycles, it's not going to render fast enough for us. So let's just switch over to Eevee so we can have a look at that as a preview. So if we go to Eevee and then switch back to rendered, give it a moment, we'll get our sky back. So let's just have a look at how that's looking. So we pull back, and yeah, you can see all of our colors change and our horizon changes color, which is nice. It looks really good. Turn our sphere back on, get a sense of what the scene's looking like, and turn off our gizmos. Yeah, great. We'll also fade our stars a little bit, so let's jump back to the first frame, and I will back off the stars, not all the way, maybe just to like 0.45, 0.46, something like that. So I'll set a keyframe there. Awesome. All right, this is looking really good. I'm really happy with this. All right, so we've effectively animated our sky. So that's how you create a procedural sky using the same approach that we used with our actual materials. So in the next tutorial, what we're going to do is get the material set up for our egg, which will be a simple, straightforward process. And then we're also going to just refine our composition and move out these spires a bit so we have a nicer frame around our central object, the egg. And the final step we need to do is just tidy up some of our materials. So some of these patches of red I'm not too happy with. I feel like they're a bit too distracting. I'd like to pull them back some. So we'll work on that and get that all finalized. And then we're off to rendering, which is going to be that final step of getting our awesome animation out of Blender and into After Effects. So I hope you learned a lot from this tutorial, really enjoyed it, and look forward to showing you the next one when I get it done. Feel free to like and subscribe to stay tuned when they come out. And yeah, let me know how you're going with these. If you're having a good time with it, maybe post up just your thoughts. And if there's any changes you'd like to see for future series, I'd really love to take that on board. So please let me know. Thanks so much, and thanks for watching.